In what is maybe the least surprising news of all time, a new YouGov poll finds that the majority of Democrats want candidates to be more like Bernie Sanders. Now, this is sort of a two-parter story, and you're going to see why. But first, I want to go over some of the details of this YouGov poll. So, this from Newsweek. The polling firm asked, do you wish the candidates who run for Congress this year will be more like or less like Bernie Sanders? A full 57% of Democratic respondents said more like Bernie Sanders in response. 16% said less, while 27% responded not sure. Not surprisingly, Sanders was less popular with conservatives. Only 13% of Republicans said they wanted candidates to be more like Sanders, while 74% said less. Independents were split. 27% said more like Sanders, while 35% said less, and 38% said not sure. Now, before I give my thoughts on this, or I guess this is part of my thoughts, but the question here is sort of vague. So while the results are largely positive, the question of do you want candidates who run for Congress to be more like Bernie Sanders? What does that mean? More like him how? More like him in policy? More like him in the way he presents himself? More like him in terms of where his focus is? Like, I'm not... It's... Or maybe more like him in terms of the fact that he's an old white man. So, depending on how you look at that question, you may respond differently. So, if you see that question and you're not really into politics, you don't really follow policy, you might think, oh, do I want more old white men to run for Congress? No, I don't want that. I want more diversity. So even though you may agree with him on the actual policy issues, you're going to say no to this question because you want candidates to be more diverse than Bernie Sanders. But if you look at this from a policy perspective, you may say yes or no, depending on how you view Bernie Sanders' policy prescriptions. So I have issues with the question here, but ultimately, even with that, even factoring in that some people, especially Democratic respondents, may be looking at this question as, do I want people to be like Bernie Sanders in terms of being an old white man? No. So factoring that in, 57% of Democratic respondents saying more like Bernie Sanders is still, I think, a good result. Now, I am a little surprised by the independents response here, simply because, actually, really, all three factions here, so independents, Republicans, and Democrats, about 30% of each were not sure. They simply said, I don't know. Do I want people to be like, do I want more members of Congress to be more like Bernie Sanders? I have no idea. So that's a large amount of people to say they're not sure. And maybe part of that is because of the way the question is phrased and not really specific in any way. So, like I said, I like the results of overall of how people feel about this, but the question is so vague that it's hard to really get anything from it. But moving on to the second part of this video that I want to talk about is, how can a Bernie Sanders-style Democrat do outside of, say, the Bronx and the Queens? So after Ocasio-Cortez won her primary over Joe Crowley, a lot of the criticism at her was, oh, well, her platform, that whole thing works in very progressive districts like her district in New York, but it's not going to work in places like Kansas. Well, in less than a month, we're going to find out. So Ocasio-Cortez is campaigning with Bernie Sanders in Kansas. So the pair will start off in Wichita, Kansas on July 20th to campaign for James Thompson in the state's 4th district. From there, they'll head to the Kansas suburbs to support former Sanders delegate Brent Welder, who is running for the Democratic nomination in the 3rd congressional district. Now, these two candidates that Bernie Sanders and Ocasio-Cortez are campaigning with are progressive Bernie Sanders-style Democrats, and they aren't in the middle of New York. They are in the middle of Kansas. So we're going to see how far-reaching this platform can be in terms of attracting voters. Now, I mean, we did sort of already see this with Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary. So he won states like Oklahoma. He won states that were looked at as not states that would go very far left, but they chose Bernie Sanders over Hillary Clinton. Now, while that works in a primary and may ultimately work in these primaries, the real test is going to be in November. So if these progressive candidates are able to pull off these wins, and I'm looking very closely, especially at Brent Welder, who has support from the Justice Democrats and has been a more high-profile candidate between these two here. So if someone like Brent Welder can win a primary as a progressive in Kansas, can he then bring that platform and win with that platform in November against a Republican? That really will be the ultimate test. So right now there's been the initial test of, okay, can Ocasio-Cortez, or someone like Ocasio-Cortez, can a progressive take down a Democratic establishment leader? And that happened with Ocasio-Cortez taking down Joe Crowley. Now, while that was one test in terms of how a progressive can do against an established Democrat, this test here is about how can progressives do in more conservative states, or states that are viewed as more conservative. Can they defeat a more establishment-style Democrat in that race? And then also, can they go on to defeat the Republican in November? So that will be the ultimate test. And these candidates, I mean, they're progressive on the issues just as much as someone like Ocasio-Cortez is. So they are for getting money out of politics, support Medicare for all, are progressive on immigration, support the Dreamers. They are for free or affordable college, and have climate change as a central issue of their campaign. So these are progressives who have a strong and bold platform. Now, I happen to think that, yes, they can win, but I might be proven wrong. So this primary is on August 7th. If you're in Kansas and you have James Thompson or Brent Welder running in your district, go out and vote. And even if they're not running in your district, go out and research who is running in your district and ensure that you are voting for somebody who actually wants to fight for you. And the biggest test to find out if that person that's running is fighting for you is if they are taking corporate PAC money. So if they are not taking corporate PAC money, that means they actually have a responsibility to the voters and not to their corporate donors.